Well, hello there. How's it going, everybody? Welcome to D4. This is the show where usually we take a deep dive into one or two character builds and crunch numbers and theorycraft about them. But today, the time has come, once again, to split my builds up and to kind of re-rank them because my spreadsheets have gotten too crowded. And it's getting too difficult to see the difference between the lines on the graphs, right? So I kind of do this about once every year or so as I need to add a new tier to, the sustained damage characters or the burst nova damage characters, etc. And yeah, that's what I'm going to be doing today, focused on the sustained DPR characters, because I just created one that's going to come out a week and a half from now, and realized I just don't have any room on my spreadsheet to fit this character in here. I got to make a new tier. So, for those who haven't seen me do things like this before, it's kind of a nice little, catalog or recap of all of, in this case, sustained DPR builds that I've done to date. So especially if you're kind of newer to the channel and you haven't watched all of them, might be a nice way to just get like a brief synopsis of all of my sustained damage characters. And, see if there's one that maybe you haven't seen a video on that you might find interesting and try and play. For everybody else, I guess it's just going to be a little trip down memory lane. These videos tend to be a lot less scripted and a lot less heavily edited, because otherwise I would never have time to actually get them out. So I hope you're okay with a few more ums and ahs and pauses and hearing me take breaths and ramble a little bit more. And for those who haven't already started doing it, feel free to bump me up to 1.5 times speed or or 2 times speed or whatever, if that helps you get through some of the more rambly bits. Anyway, one note before we jump in. I noticed, and I actually noticed this a long time ago, I just haven't done anything about it, that when I initially started creating tier scores for my characters, the way that I've always done it is to just take, the damage that we do at every armor class we account for, which is AC 10 through 25, and then average those, and also average, for each of the damage reports that we do. So level 6, level 9, level 13, level 17, right? And then I just come up with one average of all of those numbers, and that's their tier score. It's oversimplified, but it's something just to let me kind of differentiate them from one another. What I realized a long time ago is that in order to get the average, I was dividing by 15, right? 10 armor class 10 through 25. In my head, I'm thinking 15. Realized, of course, I'm not a mathematician. I needed to be dividing by 16 because, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, all the way down to 25, that's 16 numbers, not 15. So I've redone them. And I debated doing that because it's going to mean that the number that you see on the spreadsheets going forward is going to be different than the tier score I report on in the video. And hopefully that won't throw people off too much. I might end up getting comments in those videos like, you said the tier score was 73 and it's 70 or whatever, right? So you're going to see a little bit of that, but it's just been bugging me and I've wanted to adjust. So I've done that now. Everything's divided by 16, meaning that the numbers are all slightly lower. Also, something that I've done here is not only for the sustained DPR builds, previously we had 3 tiers. I'm bumping it to 4, but I'm actually adding a 5th, and this is something I've hinted at doing in the past. I wanted to add just a separate spreadsheet for builds that were focused on area of effect damage or multiple target damage, right? It's really difficult to try and compare apples to apples when you're looking at 2 different characters, and one of them is focused on doing a lot of damage to 2 or 3 targets, and one is focused on doing all of their damage to a single target, right? And a lot of people would argue and have that single target damage is a little more valuable, generally speaking, and so it's not fair to say, well, this build that does maybe more damage, but it's divided up between 2 or 3 people, is not as effective, not as efficient, not as optimal, whatever, as a single target focused character, or at the very least, it just doesn't feel genuine. It doesn't feel like you're comparing apples to apples. So for sustained damage characters, I've added a 5th tier, and they're AoE, for just the AoE focus characters, even though I only have a handful of them. I imagine over time I'll probably add to those, right? So just to kind of keep them separate. Yeah, I'm in my office. It's very sterile and boring, and we're just gonna do this because the only way it's gonna happen is if I can just crank it out without worrying about the script or editing too much. So let's jump in to what I'm calling Tier 5 right now, and that is the sustained damage characters who focus on doing damage to multiple targets. And coming in at last place for those kind of characters in Tier 5, first up we have the Artillerist. This was episode 70. The Artillerist was focused on doing damage to 2 characters at a minimum, is what I accounted for in the damage reports. And basically they were getting their Eldritch Cannon and doing kind of that area of effect damage from the Eldritch Cannon, also getting a familiar and casting Dragon's Breath, touching the familiar. So now their familiar can go up in the air and like rain down Dragon Breath fire on enemies as well. And then for our action, we were just simply using a cantrip, Acid Splash, or later on Toll the Dead. So yeah, that was the only Artillerist build I've done to date still, I think. And I have plans for another one, or at least it's on the to-do list, as so many are. It was fun, it was different, and they did pretty good damage. I mean, the tier score there was 61, which is not bad. But yeah, considering that it's spread among 2 targets, maybe slightly less optimal, some would argue, but great if you're looking for an artificer to do area of effect damage. Next up, coming in 3rd place for the area of effect damage builds with a tier score of 70, we have the Death Cleric. The Death Cleric was the first build of this kind that I ever did, where I was focused on multi-target damage, and it's a lot of fun. I played it in game. It held up really well. It was basically a focus on, casting Spirit Guardians, and then simply using the Death Cleric's ability to Toll the Dead on 2 targets, right? So you're hitting 2 targets at least with a cantrip, and then everybody else, I assumed 3 that were going to be impacted by your Spirit Guardians too. So yeah, that was fun and powerful. I was using my bonus action in that build, I think, for Spiritual Weapon, so getting a little extra damage that way. But anyway, fun build, ended up being super effective in game, did a lot of damage to a lot of enemies. So next we have the Nature Cleric coming in at 79 tier score. Nature Cleric was fun and very similar to the Death Cleric, in that the real focus was on using Spirit Guardians for most of our damage, but this time, instead of cantrip Toll the Dead and getting Spiritual Weapon out and things like that, I was just focused on trying to find effective ways to pull enemies into Spirit Guardians, because with Spirit Guardians, as many of you know, you take damage upon entering the area's effect, the spell area's effect, right? And then when they start their turn there too. So it was kind of like doing damage to multiple enemies multiple times with the same spell, right? We were using Thorn Whip, we were using Telekinesis to pull at least 2 enemies in, and then I was assuming that maybe you'd have a third as well that was getting hit by the area of effect of Spirit Guardians. Super cool. And I'm actually going to be playing kind of a modified version of this. It's sort of Nature Cleric / the Life Cleric that I did recently / the Stars Druid, Moon and Stars Druid that I did recently. It's kind of a mishmash of all 3. Check it out in our Tales of Veneria campaign coming soon. We haven't started playing that season, our 2nd season that we're calling it, yet, but we are going to be starting that next week, and so you'll probably see those videos come out in September. Finally, at number 1 for the area of effect sustained damage dealing characters, we have Greased Lightning, or the Ashardalon's Strider. I had so much fun with this build. It's just taking the Ashardalon's Stride spell, where you're basically trailing a line of fire behind you. You cast it on yourself and you run around, and everybody that you run next to takes some damage, we were doing that, but then finding ways to move with our reaction via the scout rogue, and also making a weapon attack with booming blade. So like most of the damage was to a single enemy, but then we were also assuming that we were going to be hitting at least 2 other enemies with our Ashardalon Stride a couple of times per turn. As again, the Ashardalon Stride damage is done on a turn. So you could potentially do it if you could use your reaction to run next to somebody. You could kind of do Ashardalon Stride damage twice to characters, right? So that was a lot of fun. It ended up like we took Tempest Cleric levels and switching the damage type to lightning, and then pushing enemies away by later game. We'd hit them with lightning, and then thanks to Tempest Cleric features, you could move them when they took lightning damage, and so you're running around the battlefield doing damage and also just throwing enemies behind you in your wake. I planned on playing this character for a one-shot, and then the one-shot fell through, so I have yet to play it, but it is very near the top of my to-play list. Because I just think it's just silly and funny and fun, and it might get old for a whole like year-long campaign, maybe not, but at least for a one-shot, I think it would have been a blast. So yeah, their tier score 84, if I didn't mention that, and that is tier 5, the AoE tier for sustained damage. All right, jumping into tier 4, and at the bottom of the tier 4, with a tier score of 30, we have the Shield Master. The Shield Master was a lot of fun. It was kind of my attempt to make a character that did not do damage with weapons. They just equipped a shield, and they would use it both sort of offensively and defensively. They were potentially doing a little shield bashing, but they were a lot of like grappling, right? And so they were sort of a controller / damage dealer, not really a true sort of Captain America, but yeah, that one was a lot of fun, mostly a grappler, but it was just fun to kind of try and come up with the concept of how would you build a character around just being really good with the shield, and maybe punching and kicking stuff too. So yeah, that was a good time. The Battlesmith Controller is next with a tier score of 33. That one was a lot of fun. That was my hammer time, right? Where they were sort of using light hammers, thrown hammers. I'd never done a build around thrown hammers before, and so we tried to find fun ways to sort of get the crusher feat and like push enemies into your control spells and or area of effect damage spells like web, things like that. Just kind of being a hammer bro and just chucking hammers at people, continually sort of pushing them and thereby controlling them, but also doing damage at the same time. So it was a little bit of a hybrid, right, of like damage and control. Anyway, I guess similar to the Shield Master who was grappling, right? That's why that's a big part of why the numbers for these characters are not quite as good, because we were focused on not just doing damage but also trying to do other things. Coming in at a 36 tier score, we have the Mounted Battlesmith. 2 Battlesmiths in a row. This one is old. This was my kobold riding on the back of their steel defender with 2 lances. It was kind of crazy and weird, and it might require a little buy-in from your DM, but rules as written, anyway, it works. They're just running around the battlefield spearing stuff with their lances, and it was fun. It wasn't as much damage as I think a lot of people would have expected it to be, but it was still something a little funny and crazy, and great if you're looking to be a steel defender or a battlesmith riding into combat on your steel defender with a lance. Up next is the Street Fighter with a 38 tier score. This was another one of those. They were a brawler, similar to the Shield Master in some ways. A brawler who was looking to grapple. This was something that was like a strength-based pugilist, non-monk, though I did take 1 level in monk, if I remember, and some people got mad at me for that. Anyway, but yeah, so it was just that kind of tough, street tough, and they did a lot of grappling, but they were kind of getting people down in the dirt and just, spit in their eye and gravel in their gut, kind of punching and kicking and rolling around in the mud. So that was a fun one. Then we have the Munger. The Munger with a 39 DPR, the worst name probably of any build that I've done to date. They were a Kensei monk mixed with a ranger. And this was my first monk build. It's very old and hasn't gotten a lot of views. And it was fun, but basically the idea was just to get Hunter's Mark up on your enemies. And since monks can potentially make a lot of attacks, right, with all those flurry of blows, unarmed strikes, just try and do as much damage as we possibly could, taking advantage of the lots of hits that we were getting from monks. I think looking back on it, I'd probably change a few things if I could do it again. And this was pre-Tasha's Cauldron of Everything too, so the numbers would be a little bit different nowadays. But regardless, I really enjoyed trying to do a monk build. And also I think it was maybe the first time that my eyes were opened a little bit to, oh shoot, like monks really aren't quite as strong as I would like them to be, or as I thought they were, Anyway, next is one of my favorites, I think. And the first time I ever tried to take like just a concept and just really build around the concept, putting like artificial restraints on myself in the name of character and story and theme. It was the Sorcerer with the Magic Touch with a 39 tier score. And yeah, the restriction for this character was that I could only do damage with spells that had a range of touch. So it was like the idea was that there was something inherent in my body that, like, when I would touch something, maybe like Rogue from X-Men or something like that, that's how I would do damage. But I'm not like shooting fireballs or lightning bolts or anything out at enemies. And that was cool and fun and a little weird, but pretty effective, fairly effective. We're not bringing up the rear anyway, so that's something. Next up is my first and only to date, like non-official D&D class, and it's the Blood Hunter. I had fun with this one. I'd been getting a ton of requests to do a Blood Hunter, and I know that some of you out there still want me to do more Blood Hunters. I try to stay away from doing non-official D&D content as much as I can, just because I want to cast as wide a net as possible, I suppose. But yeah, if the demand gets high enough, I'll do something. And so I did. This was a ranged damage dealer that was part artificer. I believe I went battlesmith on this one too, just to allow me to attack with my intelligence. And yeah, it was a mutant blood hunter. They ended up doing pretty good damage, especially later on in the game. They got off to a little bit of a slow start due to me trying to get 3 levels of battlesmith first. Otherwise, I'm sure the overall damage would have been higher and their tier score would have been better. But yeah, that definitely felt a little bit Geralt of Rivia from The Witcher, but maybe just with a hand crossbow instead of, swords, long swords. So anyway, that was fun. Next up, at a tier score of 43, we have the Psi Knife. This was my attempt to kind of build the ultimate psionic character, or at least weapon-dealing psionic character. So I mixed them with a little bit of Psi Warrior Fighter, and it was fun. Just a lot of thrown daggers, tons of utility that came along, I think, with the build by the end of the day, not just from rogue skills and things, but just you had some nice defensive options. You were probably never going to fail a skill check on that character, and did obviously pretty decent damage. So yeah, super flavorful and thematic. I really liked that Psi Knife. And apparently a lot of you have too, because it fairly quickly rose to be like one of my top 10 most viewed videos. So that was cool. And then finally, at the top of tier 4, now leading the way, is the Bard Locker, another terrible name, the Bard Warlock Fighter. This was my first attempt at making a Bard character that was focused on damage, not support. So they were a ranged weapon dealer, ranged damage, and they ultimately were getting like the greater invisibility spell so that they could always have advantage on their attacks. And I actually learned a lot with that build, because the assumption that I went in with was that the best ranged bard for damage was going to be, at getting to level 10, taking magical secrets and using the hunter's quiver, whatever that quiver spell is, where it lets you get 2 attacks with your bonus action. And after crunching the numbers, I realized we're better off using our concentration for just greater invisibility to have advantage. And not only that, but then using Holy Weapon as opposed to the quiver spell. Sorry, it's escaping me at the moment. Yeah, because we were getting a lot of attacks, hand crossbow, sharpshooter, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, Bard Locker, that was fun, and ended up being quite effective too. So that's tier 4. Let's move on to tier 3. All right, tier 3. At the bottom of the tier, we have the Swarmkeeper Slingshot, the Swarmkeeper Ranger. Gosh, I really had a lot of fun with this one, more than I thought I would. And it was really all about using the sling, which I'd never done and had a lot of requests for, in a way that was as effective as possible, making them, a ranger, where they were using magic stone and making sling weapon attacks, taking the crusher feat because those stones do bludgeoning damage and like pushing them into area of effect spells, right? And then also, of course, using their swarm to also, push enemies into area of effect spells. So that one was fun and kind of weird and unique and different, and ended up being pretty effective to boot. So that's always nice when you can kind of take something that's a little more niche or niche, right? A sling weapon that on the surface looks really underpowered, but finding ways to be like, well, if you're doing bludgeoning damage with it, okay, well, how does that make it different, and how can we make that unique? Taking the crusher feat, moving enemies from range, stuff like that. Since the Swarmkeeper already has the ability to move enemies with their swarm, it just seemed like a nice fit. It was fun. Next up, we have at a 46 tier score, the Beastmaster. This is Beastmaster 2.0. Beastmaster 1.0 is not here because they got such a huge rework and revamp with Tasha's Cauldron of Everything that I'm just kind of like, that build is sort of defunct now. But Beastmaster 2.0 was a lot more effective, and it was a straight ranger. I didn't do any multiclassing there, which is very unique for me. That was just like trying to maximize our ranged weapon damage and the damage that we were getting from our little beast character. And I think ultimately we ended up getting summoned beast as well, and maybe even summoned Fae later. So we kind of had like 2 pets running around on the battlefield helping us out with damage. That was a good one. If you're interested in that classic archetype, check out Beastmaster 2.0. At a 48 tier score, we have the Fae Wanderer. Wow, 3 rangers in a row. Fae Wanderer is another one of those that's near the very top of my to-play list. This one, the Fae Wanderer is easily my favorite ranger subclass, just for like the flavor and the feel and the personality of the subclass. I just love all of the little things that you get that make it feel like cool and very Fae-like and sort of whimsical and fantastical. I love it. And this character was actually a melee hunter. So they were going shillelagh on their quarterstaff and, polearm master and making lots of attacks, and then actually ultimately ended up with 2 summoned Faes to help them deal the damage and stuff. And that ended up being super effective and also really fun. They were a Leonin, I remember, so they were getting a lot of control too out of their abilities with like fear that they could do, and just kind of keep enemies locked down that way. So yeah, definitely I think a lot of potential and a lot of fun and character with that build, and I hope to play it one day. Of course, I say that about most of my builds. Next up, at a 48 also, just a slightly higher, a fraction of a point higher, was my one and only attempt to recreate a character from a third-party fiction in D&D. I kind of leave that to Tulok the Barbarian or whatever. He does a great job with that, but I'm not a huge fan of trying to take a character from my favorite book or movie or whatever and like build them in D&D. It's just kind of not my thing. I don't. Usually it feels like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, and it just feels a little wonky. But one of my favorite authors of all time, as most of you know, is Brandon Sanderson, and my favorite series of his is the Stormlight Archive. And so I did want to try my hand at recreating a Windrunner or Kaladin Stormblessed, for those who are familiar. And it was fun. It was different and unique, and I think we got pretty close to, doing a character that felt like it could play like the character reads in the novel. I don't know that I'll ever do others like that, despite a lot of requests that I get to do Aang from Last Airbender, or some character from the Marvel Universe or Star Wars or whatever. Wheel of Time, Matt Cawthon, I could actually see a build for that, but I don't know if I will again in the future. But it was a fun experiment and ended up being fairly effective, I think. Next up, at a 49 tier score, we have the Moon Druid, my first Moon Druid. And that build was basically all about concentrating on a spell, going into bear form, grappling, and then maybe dragging them through spike growth, or just holding them in like moonbeam or something like that, while also making like claw attacks. And again, ended up being super effective. And of course, because you're a Moon Druid, that means you're going to have some nice support features when you're out of combat, at least some really nice survivability features, and super solid damage, obviously. So even though a lot of people, I think, like to complain about the Moon Druid that they're too powerful early on in their career, and then they plateau really, really early, as the beasts that you can transform into just kind of become less and less powerful. I think if you focus on spells in the right way and kind of grappling and making attacks still, you can still be super effective from a damage perspective. So that was a fun discovery, I think. Ooh, next up, the Undead Support Lock. Gosh, I haven't thought about this character for a long time. They were also a 49 tier score, and I called them a support lock because my idea for the character when I first started building them was that they were primarily going to be a support character. They were all about control. So they were an undead warlock, also with what is it? Oath of Conquest Paladin, I think. The one that if they're feared and they're in your aura, they can't move. This is why I warned you at the beginning it was unscripted. Anyway, they take some Paladin levels too. And they were all about just like fearing as many enemies as possible and just locking them down. And so they, could put out some really serious control while also doing some pretty decent damage. More damage than I would have expected, I guess, as my initial plan for them was just to be a controller type character. But I crunched numbers on them anyway and was like, ooh, that's pretty potent for a character that's really not supposed to be very good at damage. So really potentially powerful character there, as long as you're fighting enemies who aren't immune or resistant to fear. And I know that as you get into higher levels especially, you do run into those a lot. So that would be one of those that it's like you want to talk with your DM about and say, hey, here's my concept for this character. Is this going to work? Are you going to have a ton of, fear immune enemies here? Because if not, or if you are, then maybe I'll play something else, right? Anyway, that was a good one. Next up, at a 49 as well, slight fraction higher, we have the Spore Beast. This was a Beast Barbarian mixed with a Spore Druid, and another one that I had a lot of fun with, but also, ended up being really, really well-rounded. The concept was the Beast Barbarian can make a ton of attacks, right? So let's find a really good, easy way to add damage to each of those attacks. But that's not spell-based because you're a barbarian and you're raging. And the Spore Druid was my favorite pick to do that because they do get to add damage to each attack, so long as they maintain temporary hit points granted them by the Spore Druid feature, right? And so you had to take a lot of Spore Druid levels in order to consider this damage sustainable because you're going to be taking hits. At the end of the day, it was fun, it was powerful, and again, because you are a barbarian and a druid, you brought a lot of survivability and support options, at least outside of combat, with you to the battlefield. So it was like you could really kind of have your cake and eat it too, and be like a high damage dealer, but also be pretty hard to kill and provide a lot of support and utility sort of outside of combat, which I really love. And most of my support characters that I build, I feel like tend to be ones that are like, well, yeah, I can heal, but also I can really bring the hammer down once in a while if I want to, or I can kind of be really tanky or whatever, just something other than just trying to heal your allies all the time. That's how I like to play them. Anyway, next up at a tier score of 50, we have the Great Weapon Master Phytarian. This was a very early build, and it was really my attempt to learn, okay, which class can take better advantage of the Great Weapon Master feat, barbarians or fighters? And the answer, surprising probably nobody, ended up being both. So yeah, it was a multi-class character, of course, with lots of levels in fighter. I went Rune Knight, if I'm not mistaken, and I think I was using the Unearthed Arcana version of Rune Knight at the time. And so these numbers are probably inflated. I don't typically go back and redo numbers when rule changes happen, because that would be a full-time job. I can't remember if I adjusted these numbers after the fact when Rune Knight became official. But at the end of the day, it still would work really well. And yeah, you take 11 levels of fighter to get that third attack, and then barbarian for rage and reckless attack and all of those things. And I actually played a version of this character as well in a campaign that I did with my friends, our Bronze Battalion campaign. And it was a lot of fun. Ander was just kind of your big, hulking, maybe kind of dumb, heart of gold barbarian fighter that just did so much damage, and it was so reliable, right? And it was so easy with reckless attack and rage and all of those attacks that you're making. It was just, yeah, that was a fun character. I really enjoyed it, and that's maybe the first and only character I've ever played that was just kind of a big beefcake meathead, and it was fun to lean into that once in a while. If you've never done it, I highly recommend it. Next up, we have the Frost Mage. Here's a fairly recent build. Yeah, this was one that I was really pleased at how much damage they did do, considering the restrictions that I gave myself, right? This was another one of those, like, they can only do damage in these certain conditions, and for this character, obviously, it was, cold damage. And so we ended up going Fathomless Warlock for that Tentacle Whip, and, among other things, just finding ways to get lots of good cold damage spells, and ended up doing some significant DPR just via just being restricted to cold, and then also bringing a lot of control with them too, because cold naturally, most cold spells anyway, are slowing if nothing else, or stopping enemies in place too. So that was a big goal for me. I didn't want to just do cold damage. I wanted to make it feel like we were doing things that you would expect cold damage spells to do, right? Slow and snare and freeze in place and stuff like that. So yeah, had a lot of fun with that and was really pleased with how it turned out. Next up, the Eldritch Sorcerer. Wow, this was my first sorcerer build, I believe. And my first non-Hexblade Warlock, too, for that matter. This was early build. And it was really, this one kind of, I saw a version of this build online before I even started the channel, and it kind of is the thing that gave me the idea to start this channel in the first place, because this Reddit user was claiming that this build was better than any other sustained damage build that you could come up with in D&D. And I was like, I wonder if that's true. Like, maybe it would be fun to try to create as many powerful characters as I can and compare them to each other. And so that kind of started it. But yeah, this character was essentially just using Eldritch Blast and casting darkness on themselves with Devil Sight so they'd get advantage, and then just taking Divine Soul Sorcerer levels for all of the neat tricks that you get with Divine Soul Sorcerer, but also getting Spiritual Weapon, using that for our bonus action, and just upcasting it even to do as much damage as we could with our bonus action, getting tons of Eldritch Blast attacks, I think using Hex. And now that I say that out loud, I think I'm lying. I think I might have gone a Hexblade Warlock there to get Hexblade's Curse. Maybe. I can't remember now. Probably. Anyway, yeah, it was fun. Pretty straightforward. Just, Eldritch Blasting stuff from Darkness and Spiritual Hammer, but because you have all those Divine Soul Sorcerer levels, it ended up being mostly Divine Soul Sorcerer, you had a lot of blast options, AoE options, and even support options thanks to the Cleric spell list, right? So pretty well-rounded character, pretty fun. All right, that is tier 3. Let's see what tier 2 has to offer. All right, at the bottom of tier 2, we start off at a 50 tier score, and it's the crossbow fighter. The ranged fighter, this was my second episode. And it was kind of, again, the early episodes especially were all attempts by me to just take sort of like the known best, damage builds in D&D that I could find online or whatever, and just try to be like, okay, I want to see how far I can stretch this. And yeah, it was just your pretty straightforward Rune Knight fighter that was taking crossbow expert and sharpshooter and just making as many attacks as we could, and doing as much damage as we could. And it works, obviously. It was fairly effective. I think this was another one, that I was using the Unearthed Arcana version of the Rune Knight, so adding a d6 to every attack instead of just once per turn. And so if I didn't adjust these numbers, then they might be a little inflated, which actually I love, because I think a lot of people, even now today, that you talk to would be like, best damage dealing character, fighter, battle master. Most people would probably say crossbow expert, sharpshooter. There you go. Just pump them full of arrows, And I love the fact that they're like bottom of tier 2 compared to all these other, things that we've done. And now, granted, there's something to be said for the reliability with which this character does damage. You can pretty much just do this amount of damage all the time, every time, expending no resources that I know of, that I can think of. But yeah, if you get a little creative and try and find ways to get advantage, and what spell are you concentrating on, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we can do better. So that's fun. Anyway, that was a good one. We have next up, the Thornlock at a 51 tier score. Man, I love this character. This is also another one that would be near the top of my to play list, but probably just for a one shot. This was another very restricted character, right? We can only do damage as a result of somebody hitting us. So like they would hit us, and since they hit us, they take damage on return, right? So we were just finding all the ways that we could of like any spell, any feature ability in the game that says like when you get hit in melee, then your attacker takes damage, right? And so we were just casting spells on ourselves like Armor of Agathis, Fire Shield, things like that, and just running up and like grappling enemies and just holding on to them, and they are punching us and just taking a bunch of damage for punching us. And I don't know, I love the concept so much. It was weird and crazy and silly and fun and funny, and I would absolutely love to try it out in game and see if it worked. Obviously, it's another one of those that would require a lot of buy-in from your DM. You'd have to say, look, this is the only way my character can do damage, so when I grapple somebody, will you please make them attack me and not just try and escape? Otherwise, I'm going to just be fairly worthless, So anyway, it's fun. Next up, at a 52 tier score, we have the Bladesinger Monk. This was the character that I played with Monty and Kelly from Dungeon Dudes, and Chris from Treant Monk's Temple, and even Eric from Fry Minis, in the celebratory 50,000 subscriber one shot that we did with those guys to celebrate Chris, Treant Monk, hitting 50,000 subscribers. Anyway, super fun, taking like the most, like my favorite character that I've played in game, the Bladesinger, and pairing them with my favorite class conceptually, the Monk, right? And just trying to combine them into one character. And it was a level 20 character, and they had 14 levels of Monk and 6 levels of Bladesinger. And it was fun. They were super agile, did a lot of good damage, bobbing and weaving, crazy good defensive abilities as well. Just a really well-rounded, fun character for sure. Next up, at 53 tier score, we have the Shadow Master. This was very recent. Yeah, this was the mostly Shadow Monk, but mixed with a healthy heaping of Warlock levels too. It was kind of if I could go back in time and recreate my first character that I ever played in 5e, this is how I would have built it, a Shadow Monk trying to just take advantage of, the darkness abilities that you can get, They were genie warlock, so doing a little extra damage, and yeah, just punching stuff as much as we could and finding ways to add damage to all of those punches. At first Hex, and then I think later Spirit Shroud. And it was obviously fairly effective, and a great way to kind of live your best Shadow Monk life while also maximizing damage as best you could. So yeah, I was really happy with how that turned out, and I wish I could go back to my original 5e character and play it that way. Next up, at the 54 tier score, we have the Infiltrator. This was my attempt to build a character that was sort of more Infiltrator armorer than anything. And it was a lot of fun. We took a little bit of fighter, mostly for the fighting, or for the archery fighting style, a little bit of rogue late to get some extra sneak attack damage, but really we were sort of a rogue that wasn't a rogue for the most part, right? Just focused on being kind of this stealthy character, but that did lots of damage, mostly lightning-based damage, right? Via their armorer special weapon. Getting lots of attacks, adding sharpshooter damage to that, trying to find ways to get advantage, maybe via fairy fire or using bless on ourselves and our allies and things like that. Yeah, that was a fun one, and I think made a really great sort of like techie secret agent James Bond-esque type character almost, right? Potentially, maybe if James Bond wore a mecha suit. Up after the Infiltrator, we have also at a 54 tier score was the Swashbuckler. This one was great, but if you watch the video as is, there's a really big mistake that I made. This was like the first time I think that I ever made a mistake big enough in a build that I had to release like an errata video for it. That basically went, it doesn't quite work like I wanted it to because I made a mistake with 2-weapon fighting and using Booming Blade. That said, after Tasha's Cauldron of Everything came out, shortly thereafter, it might have been the next week, I did a Tasha's video and kind of said, hey, here's how we would rework the Swashbuckler. Thanks to the changes that have been made to Beastmaster, it's actually even better. So I don't know if I reworked these numbers for that better build. If I didn't, then they're going to be a little better than what we're seeing here, because taking a 3-level Beastmaster dip there gave us a nice weaponized bonus action. And, we still got to get all the other juicy benefits that we were getting from being a Swashbuckler, and lots of sneak attack damage and moving in and out of combat. It was fun. Then, of course, we have, also at 54, for a 54 tier score, my 100th episode, the Shadowblade. And this shattered every record for any video that I've done to date as far as like quickest to certain milestones, which was before that held by the Eldritch Blade Master that I'll talk about in a second. But anyway, yeah, Shadowblade was fun. It was another one of those like, let's build around a weapon characters, but the weapon here, of course, was not a conventional one. It was the spell. It was the Shadowblade spell, which is probably my favorite spell in the game, as weird as that may sound. I just really like lightsabers. Yeah, it was mostly Bladesinger with a little bit of Twilight Cleric to give us like dim light all of the time, or basically all of the time, so that we could actually assume advantage with our Shadowblade. And yeah, we just kind of did everything we could to kind of optimize the damage that we would get out of that spell, and getting to be a Bladesinger at the same time, and those nice perks from the arguably overpowered Twilight Cleric just made it both a fun and also potent, powerful build that could be pretty well rounded. And I mean, at the end of the day, like with all Bladesingers, right, you are a high-level wizard, so the options that you have at your fingertips, thanks to your huge spell list, are seemingly endless at times, especially if you got a little bit of cleric levels in there too to help you with some support features, right? So that was a great one, a lot of fun, and thanks to everybody who's watched it, because it's just about to enter like a top 10 video for me of all time for like most views, and it's only been out for less than a couple of months at the time I'm recording this anyway. So I was really, really happy to see how well that did. Then we have the Eldritch Blade Master with a tier score of 55. This, for a long time, was a record-setting build for me. Like it was the first, I think it was the the fastest to 10,000 views, to 20,000 views, to 30,000 views for a really long time. And it was basically my attempt to create a character that focused on 2-weapon fighting. And just like, even though it might be suboptimal damage-wise, okay, fine, well, what's the best we can do, right? And they ended up being a Blade Singer mixed with an Eldritch Knight. And yeah, they were fun, they were potent, and just kind of a whirling dervish of blades. It was kind of the concept that I tried to go with. And I think it ended up being super effective, and it kind of, yeah, it did about as good as we could do with 2-weapon fighting. And yeah, to get near the top of tier 2, that's not bad, right? So that was fun. And yeah, still to date, I think it's like my 3rd most viewed video, I want to say. So it seems like a lot of you liked it as well. It was a fun one. Coming in at a 56 tier score, next up we have the Crit Fisher, right? So this character was like a barbarian fighter for champion, so you could crit on a 19, paladin for divine smite, and then actually sorcerer through the end, so you could have more spells with which to smite. And yeah, the concept was just like get the best critical hit chance that I could, short of taking elven accuracy. That's kind of a whole nother thing. But anyway, you know, just being like a fighter barbarian and just taking a pike for the piercer feat, half orc, finding all of the ways that we could just like make our critical hits as powerful as possible, right? And increase our critical hit chance as best we could too. So that when you did crit, you were adding like a die for the piercer feat, a die for your half orc, and then smiting at the highest spell level that you possibly could, and just doing massive critical hit damage. But we called them a sustained damage build because I had no way to know when you were going to crit necessarily, right? So even though it was kind of bursty, I would just average out like that burst damage and call it sustained DPR. So yeah, it was a little bit hybridy in that sense, but I was happy with the way that it turned out and had a lot of fun building it, and had a lot of people up to that point request something like it. So anyway, good times with the ultimate Crit Fisher. And then finally, at the very top of tier 2 now, is the Pokemon Trainer with a 58 tier score. I think I spent more time on this build than any other build I've done to date. It took me hours and hours to kind of put this all together. And this was another one of those restrictive builds, right? Where it's like, okay, the concept here is I can only do damage via like the pets that I have summoned. So I can't make any attacks. And so they were multi-classing all over the place. Wildfire, Druid, Beastmaster, Ranger. I ended up going Paladin for Find Greater Steed. I can't even remember. We were summoning a beast at one point, and we ended up, by the end, I think, in a familiar, we had like 4 or 5 pets, right? That is just this walking menagerie. And it was a lot of fun, and it just kind of took me forever to like figure out, okay, like which are the best pets and what are all the different ones that we could get, and what's the optimal sort of way to take levels, at what level are we multi-classing, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. And ends up being pretty potent. My friend and DM Corey played this in our 20K. When I hit 20K subscribers, we played it in a one-shot. It was a PvP, the second PvP fight that we ever did. And he used it to great effect. All of those pets and summons and things that he had out there just kind of wreaking havoc on the battlefield. It was a lot of fun. And that's tier 2. So next up, finally, tier 1. All right, coming down the home stretch, tier 1. And bringing up the rear at tier 1 with a 59 tier score is the Gunk, the gun-using Kensei monk that I just finished editing a couple of days ago. And when I'm recording this, it hasn't actually been released yet, but I think that I'll wait to release this until after that goes live. Anyway, in the video, I think I said they were near the bottom of tier 1, and now that I've kind of redone things, they're at the very bottom of tier 1, but hey, still tier 1. You're still a monk that's mostly monk in tier 1, and that in and of itself is pretty great, I think. But yeah, I also took, a little bit of fighter in there. I took a little bit of ranger in there. But the idea basically is to, throw down fog cloud, then with blind fighting, so you have advantage, just make a bunch of rifle attacks, or I should say musket attacks, on your enemy, and do a ton of damage and get 3 attacks per round, even though you don't have crossbow expert feat stuff. But thanks to all of the new monk features that we've gotten from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, mostly, we can actually make that bonus action attack as long as we have key points to spend. So cool, fun, I love it. But you guys know, because it probably just came out like a day or two ago when you're watching this. Anyway, next up, also at 59 for a tier score, just slightly higher fractionally, we have the Drake Warden Ranger, and that actually surprises me. I think about that build and am finding myself surprised that it's done as well as it has. That might be my highest Ranger damage-wise here still in the builds. That was, all about summoning a pet dragon and using them to make attacks with, as well as like summoned beasts and your ranged weapons, and yeah, like I took more Peace Cleric on that build than actual Ranger, and I got a little pushback from some people on that, which I appreciate. Peace Cleric, some people think is overpowered. I'm not quite convinced, but it is very strong. But mostly I wanted it because since I was going to have pets, I wanted to be able to give them, that extra D4 to hit that Peace Clerics get. Anyway, that was a fun build, and really kind of the best How to Train Your Dragon build that I've come up with, though we didn't get into those late Drake Warden features like that let you ride a flying dragon into battle and stuff like that. But anyway, up next at 60 tier score is the Dive Bomber, Grapple, Fly, Drop. Yeah, this was another like really gimmicky one that, was like, we're only going to do damage in this one certain way. And everybody keeps talking, and people would keep talking in the comments about, what if you built a character that could fly and you grab somebody and fly up into there and then drop them? Like how strong could you make that? And so I was like, you know what, let's find out. And it was a lot of fun. It's another one of those that you definitely have to like talk with your DM about and be like, okay, this is my character, this is their thing, like this is what I do. Are we going to be underground a lot? Are we going to be in buildings a lot? Are you going to be okay with this? Are you going to allow this? But assuming that they're on board, and it might be one of those that's better in a one shot than a full campaign, but I think it would be a total blast to play and just hilarious, where you're just grabbing people and just flying up as high as you possibly can and just letting them go. So they hit the ground and take a ton of damage. Then we have what I consider to be my most problematic build, and I've gone back and forth on this. I'm tempted to just remove it, frankly, from the tier sheets because I don't think it's very viable. And of all of the builds that I've done, it's maybe the least viable. And it was the Grappler Monk. I was so excited about this build when I first made it, and I just thought it was like the greatest thing ever. But I was using the Unearthed Arcana, notice a pattern of mistakes here, the Unearthed Arcana version of the Spore Druid at the time to get a lot of extra damage for all of the attacks that we were doing. We were an astral self monk, Way of the Astral Self, and using our astral arms to grapple and then making unarmed strikes. Or maybe we were grappling and making unarmed strikes with the astral arms, now that I think about it. But anyway, grappling, making lots of attacks, doing lots of damage, thanks in no small part to the Spores Druid feature. But I only took 2 levels of Spores Druid, because at the time you didn't need to keep the temporary hit points that Spores Druid gave you in order to continue to do that damage. And that was a big mistake. And after realizing that, I think I kind of looked back on the build and went, I just have a hard time imagining this really working in game. And if I were to redo it today, I'd do it differently. And maybe one day I'll just redo it and come up with something, and then I can replace these numbers, and they'll probably be more like in tier 2 or even tier 3. But anyway, it was a fun thought experiment, but just one of those that probably doesn't work outside of the lab as well as inside of the lab of, theory crafting. Then we have at 63 also, tier score, the Holy Warrior. This was a fun one, and this was like my attempt to answer the question, can we make a paladin build that's focused not on burst damage, because that's the temptation, right, is to just look at Divine Smite and go, okay, how can we maximize Divine Smite? That's what I usually do with paladins. But to go, no, let's ignore burst and just try and build for sustained damage, sustained DPR. And so, yeah, we took mostly Pally levels here. It was Devotion Paladin with also a dip into the Zealot Barbarian, which I think paired perfectly together thematically, and then gave us that advantage from Reckless Attack and a little bonus damage from Rage and all those great early level Barbarian features. The thing that was great about that build is because you're a Paladin, and mostly Paladin, you naturally have good defense, that great support options from heals to your auras, right? Especially aura of protection, heavy armor wearing or medium, since we'd be going barbarian, and then just doing tons of like sustained damage, and of course having lots of great burst damage options because you do have Divine Smite still. So that was, I felt like, maybe one of the more well-rounded characters that I've done to date, and also like really, really solid sustained DPR, at least one combat encounter per short rest. So yeah, that was a great one, a lot of fun. One that I think I'll build my next Paladin after that archetype, that Holy Warrior. Coming in next, also at a 63 tier score, we have the Berserker Lurker. This was just a couple of weeks ago at the time that I'm recording this anyway, and that was a lot of fun. That was, again, an attempt to take advantage of the fact that rogues can get sneak attack damage once on a turn, as opposed to once on their turn only, right? And so if you can find a way to reliably get an attack with your reaction, and thus on someone else's turn, you could get sneak attack damage twice in a round. And so we went Berserker Barbarian, even though I know it makes a lot of us cringe, me included, because of the exhaustion that they have to suffer. But at least once per day anyway, you'd be able to get this bonus action attack, hold your action, and then, make an attack with your reaction and your held action to get sneak attack twice in a round. And yeah, we ended up going Phantom Rogue there, but though I think the Rogue subclass is maybe not super important. We were really there for sneak attack above all. And so I could see you going a different subclass route if you really wanted to. But yeah, that was fun. It was just, you were strength-based. You were a strength-based rogue, obviously, in order to take advantage of, some of those important barbarian features. And so it was different and unique, but still, like, able to be a good rogue and have a lot of utility as well as tons of damage. So coming in at 64, it's the build that started it all. The Pamlock, I called it at the time, the Polearm Master Warlock. This was just the Hexblade, just a typical Hexblade that, you could probably find this build or something like it on, online just about anywhere in 3D6 on Reddit or whatever. And it was just a straight Warlock build. My very first episode, and it was just like, we're going to cast Darkness, we've got Devil Sight, we're taking a Halberd, and we've got Great Weapon Master and Polearm Master, and what can we do? What's our sustained damage look like? And obviously it's really good. There's only a few that I've built to date that can top it, and even the ones as I'm looking at them here, like, there's maybe some caveats and grains of salt and on the ones that are about to come next that might not necessarily apply to the Polearm Master Warlock, though relying on the darkness tactic, of course, can be problematic depending on your table. And until you got to level 7 anyway, where you get Shadow of Moil, you got to deal with the fact that you've got a 30-foot bubble of darkness on the battlefield all the time. And if that's not going to work for whatever reason, then obviously these numbers go way down. So that's something to contend with. I guess there's a grain of salt there too. But it was a good one, always strong. Up next is the Stars Druid. Love that Stars Druid. This was it was also, I called it, what did I call it? The Moon and Stars. That's right, the Moon and Stars. Because we were trying to take advantage of the Moonbeam spell and the Stars Druid, but built for sustained damage, right? So they were going Archer form. We were throwing down Moonbeam, and then because Moonbeam works similar to, say, Cloud of Daggers or Spirit Guardians, where the creature will take damage upon entering it, and when they start their turn there, just finding ways to double up on the damage that we were doing every round with Moonbeam. So making Archer attacks, taking a Genie Warlock level so that we could apply bludgeoning damage, and then with the Crusher feat pushing them into Moonbeam so that they're taking damage from the Archer attack, they're taking damage from Moonbeam upon entering it, they're taking damage from Moonbeam at the start of their turn, and then we're just hitting them with cantrips or whatever. Or maybe even there was like a Shillelagh option where you can bonk them with your quarterstaff when they come out of your Moonbeam. Anyway, that one was fun, and again, that's one that I kind of picked some pieces from to use along with the Nature Cleric and Death Cleric, combined with this to make the build that I'm going to be playing in our campaign coming up here in a week, for me anyway. So yeah, loved that build. It was a lot of fun, super potent, but not quite as potent as the number 2 option, which turns out to be the Sorlock Cheese Grater. I had so many requests to do a build like this for so long that I just kept putting off, and when I finally did it, it was so fun, right? And yeah, the concept here is, being a Sorlock, a Sorcerer Warlock, where you are throwing down Spike Growth, and then mostly just using Eldritch Blast, and with like Repelling Blast and Grasp of Hadar and all of those like great movement abilities that you can get via invocations and Warlock levels, right? To sort of hit them with Eldritch Blast, push them through Spike Growth. We were taking Sorcerer levels to get like Quicken Spell to kind of set everything up a little bit earlier, among other things. And we even eventually got Telekinetic, I think, there to do a little extra movement on people. So yeah, it was just throw down Spike Growth and just start grating the cheese over the Spike Growth with the enemy, pushing them back and forth with your Eldritch Blasts. Super potent, a lot of fun, and potentially problematic for sure, because Spike Growth takes up a big area, and that could make it difficult for your allies, particularly your melee allies. But that's also something that you could just do a whole party build around, throw that Moon Druid in there to be grappling and dragging back and forth on the Spike Growth, and any other, character builds that you could do that had a lot of forced enemy movement, and it'd be potent. But coming in at number 1 and returning to their number 1 spot because I split out the area of effect multi-target characters is my darling baby, the Bladesinger. Of course, you knew that was going to happen. Of course, I was going to tweak the spreadsheet in the Bladesinger's favor so they could regain their top spot. Looking back on Bladesinger 2.0, I love it. I do. There were problems with it, no question. That said, while the numbers may have been a little bit inflated because, for example, I was assuming that the enemies were not going to be resistant to your animated objects, which most enemies at higher level probably would be, because it's not necessarily considered magic damage, even though the animated objects were animated by a spell. Depends on your table, I guess. But anyway, and making assumptions like you're always going to be in dim light or darkness when you're attacking with Shadow Blade, things like that. The numbers also, like in hindsight today, were probably a little deflated in that they were not accounting for being able to use Booming Blade after level 6 anyway, casting, when Bladesingers get their cantrip as part of the extra attack, using Booming Blade with maybe like a short sword that you have in your offhand kind of thing, and you guys have heard me talk about that ad nauseum. But so I might have been leaving a little damage off the spreadsheets as well. At the end of the day, I think the damage numbers might still be a little bit inflated because of that animated objects issue. and I might need to go back and redress that. So yeah, when I did the Shadow Blade build, right, it was sort of like a Blade Singer 3.0 because I sort of intentionally tried to get myself dim light all of the time so I could assume advantage with the Shadow Blade, right? And we just focused on using the Shadow Blade. Yeah, Blade Singer 2.0. Regains their title as the best single target sustained damage dealing character that I've built to date, even though there's a little asterisk there that, you know, may or may not apply at your table. So I love that one. Again, it was the most fun that I've ever had playing a character, just mechanically speaking anyway, at a table. And I know that a lot of you agree because it's by far my most viewed video and kind of feel like it's the thing that put me on the map. So thank you for watching it, all of you who have, and especially those of you who have watched it like 10 times, because I know there's a lot of you that have done that too. Anyway, that is ranking my builds 2022 version, all 5 tiers. I hope you guys have enjoyed listening and taking that trip down memory lane with me. I've had fun doing so. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions on, you know, any of the builds, how they went, any questions on how I crunch numbers. It's not particularly complicated, but anyway, you guys are awesome. Love you, and we'll see you again soon.